All right, so welcome back to the third part of our notes on Chapter 13 and the build up to the Civil War. Normally we have 3 videos, I know, for each chapter, but this time there's going to be 4 just because this is a little bit longer of a chapter, so there's a little bit more to talk about. So we'll remember we're going to have the quiz, essay quiz on Wednesday. And in tomorrow's video, I'll tell you a little bit about how to construct a document-based question, which is going to be what this essay is going to be. And that'll be, and that'll be what we have as Wednesday approaches. So anyway, we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so as you know from the last 2 days, or the last 2 videos, I should say, there's all these things that are kind of happening that are starting to create more sectional division between the North and South. The Mexican War is a big deal because of all the territory gained. Also a big deal is, the Compromise of 1850, because again, compromises, nobody's totally happy. So, we've got some problems still to deal with here. But you're going to find out as we get in through the 1850s, things start to really and quickly get much, much worse in the country as we kind of approach the point of no return here, which of course is going to be civil war. So it can be best described as really an uneasy truce between the North and South. We're okay. We've got both sides got a little bit of what they want in the Compromise of 1850, so it's all right. But again, that can change really, really easily. Okay, just you need just a little something to happen to kind of tip the scales in favor of one side or the other. And when you're talking about a passionate issue like slavery or anti-slavery, it makes sense. It's not going to be long before people on both sides kind of start doing, their own thing, regardless of the law. So the divisions that you see are going to grow throughout this decade and become really, really serious. Okay, so starting with the Fugitive Slave Act. So the Fugitive Slave Act was something that the South was okay with in the Compromise of 1850. It's something that they got out of the Compromise, so they found it to be acceptable, right? And they didn't get California. We already discussed how popular sovereignty really isn't going to help them out all that much. But here we are with the Fugitive Slave Act, which is now being kind of opposed by the North. And that's one part of the compromise that the South kind of was happy about, because now the Northerners can be punished, the anti-slavery folks can be punished for not following the law. Well, what they find out pretty quick is that there's a lot of people in the North that are opposing the Fugitive Slave Act. In fact, some states pass laws of their own that kind of defy the Slave Act, saying that freed slaves that have escaped to certain states can't be sent back to the South. So the South suddenly is very, very angry because the North isn't abiding by these laws. So the South, understandably, is really upset. We've been screwed over again. They're trying to take our slaves away. They're trying to take our livelihood away, so on and so forth. You have to a certain extent, right? Now the South is wrong here because slavery is wrong. But the reason they're so passionate about it is because it's a way of life for them. Slavery in the South, because of its economic importance, would be like making laws banning religion in the northern states, right? Religion is very important to people in the North, probably a little bit more so than in the South. So, if you took that away from the people in the North or threatened to do that, they would react in a similar way. Because the whole economic system of the South is predicated on slavery. So to take that away, the fear of the people in the South is it'll totally destroy their economy, and that's just not something that they can live with. All right. So another thing that we see kind of emerge out of this is kind of a new political movement in America called the Young American Movement. This was a kind of a result of Manifest Destiny. So again, cause and effect. So Manifest Destiny is a popular ideology, of course, in the 1840s and 50s. The Young American Movement is this group of kind of young, reform-minded people in the country that essentially believe in the extension of American democracy to other places around the world. And the way they feel that we should do this is by expanding America's influence to other parts of the world, to acquire more territory and more lands and spread our ideologies of democracy to other places. Now, again, this means gaining new territory, and underneath everything, the undercurrent of everything that's going on here has to do with the gaining of new territory. New territory makes everybody nervous because is it going to be slave? Is it going to be free? We don't know. And out of that, everybody, gets very anxious and very concerned about what the status of slavery is going to be in these areas. And so the Young American Movement is kind of a result of that. And though it doesn't really immediately result in any new land territorial gains, the ideology behind it is something that is going to drive people to further kind of push us towards sectional division. Okay, so another further thing that kind of separates the two sides is something called the Ostend Manifesto. The Ostend Manifesto was an attempt by the South to add Cuba to the United States as a slave state. We'd often talked about trying to annex Cuba. Many American politicians have been against it because we're trying to somewhat stay out of international conflicts and affairs, and to take Cuba would be to have armed conflict with Spain and have another war, which at this point we don't really want. We're happy with what we got out of the Mexican War, and people aren't really feeling this, right? So basically, a couple pro-slavery Southerners are over in Belgium, and they meet to try to find a way to acquire Cuba from Spain. And word of this gets back to Europe and the United States, like other places in Europe and in the United States, who denounce the idea because Europe at this time has moved away from slavery. There's lots of reform and social change movements going on in Europe that are really anti-slavery. And they know that the reason that the South is pushing to add Cuba is because they want to make it a slave state or slave territory. So Europeans denounce it, and of course anti-slavery Northerners denounce it as well. So the North is really mad here because the South is kind of going behind the back of the rest of the country, the North, or whatever you want to call it, to try to make, again, to try to make more territory for the South and give them more room to expand slavery, which of course nobody wants. Okay, another big problem that exacerbates or makes worse the crisis of the 1950s is the fact that we have a string of really bad presidents during the 1850s. Did I say 1950s before? I'm sorry. So we get a lot of bad presidents during the 1850s, beginning with, we talked about Zachary Taylor already and how he died, and he was replaced by a guy named Millard Fillmore, who nobody really liked and was unable to really accomplish much as president. It's kind of a confusing thing in what you do when a president dies. Still, like I said with John Tyler, nobody really liked Tyler because the Whigs viewed him as not a true Whig, and Democrats viewed him as a traitor to the Democratic Party because he was with a Whig as president. So you have a lot of animosity there, and then so they never really respected Tyler all that much. And then when Millard Fillmore becomes president, it's kind of the same situation. He never really takes on a vice president, um, and is also unable to do much as president because, again, he wasn't the guy that they picked, right? They picked Zachary Taylor, and he's not there. Now they got this Millard Fillmore. I guess, I don't know. It depends on the person, but certainly a lot of people, support Trump because he's Trump, or support Biden because he's Biden, and it might be very different if Mike Pence or Kamala Harris were president in terms of how people would support, but not nearly as bad, I don't think. As much division as we have now, not nearly as bad as how people felt back then. So anyway, in 1852, the election of 1852 brings Franklin Pierce to the presidency. Franklin Pierce is kind of an interesting character for the presidency as well. He's actually a distant relative of the Bush family. And he's a Democrat from New Hampshire, elected in 1852. And his presidency he's kind of like a pro-slavery northerner, which is kind of weird. So like he supports the Ostend Manifesto. He supports some of the other things we're going to talk about shortly. So he's generally not that well liked. And another big problem for Pierce is that he was a big alcoholic, kind of for sad reasons. When his family was traveling from New Hampshire to come to Washington to move into the White House, there was an accident with their carriage, and their daughter was thrown from the carriage and killed. And that had like a huge effect on Pierce that he never like really emotionally recovered from. And it just kind of made him kind of a nothing president. So after 4 years, he doesn't even run for re-election, and the Democrats put up another guy by the name of James Buchanan. James Buchanan stands out for a couple of reasons as president. One, because he's the only president we've ever had that was never married. Whenever there needed to be a woman there that to fulfill like the roles of the first lady, he brought in his niece Harriet to kind of fill those things. There was also rumors that he may have been homosexual, but a little bit of that's revisionist history, so we don't know how much truth there is to that. Buchanan is another guy who he was from Pennsylvania, so he was a northerner. He's also a Democrat. But he had been an ambassador for much of the time, and just seemed somewhat disinterested in the presidency. He was not an effective decision maker. Buchanan wasn't, and he was unable to really accomplish much as president. He kind of just, rather than making firm decisions, he kind of just let things slide and let things happen. And this pushes us closer and closer through this crisis, towards obviously civil war. So this is the challenge of poor leadership, right? When you have bad political leadership, it causes problems. By ignoring problems, it causes them to become worse rather than just trying to maintain a status quo. And unfortunately, the presidents we had in the 1850s largely tried to maintain some sort of status quo when there really wasn't one to be maintained. And it caused a lot of rifts and problems in the country that obviously are really going to push us to civil war. So in many ways, as much as anything else that leads us to this civil war, it's the weak leadership America has in the White House during the 1850s that really helps make things worse, right? If you have one good president in there during that time that makes decisions and does things, maybe you can put off or at least find a better solution to some of the crises that were growing during this time. And of course, when Lincoln gets elected, which we'll talk about in tomorrow's video, is going to make things even more challenging. Okay, so interestingly enough, another thing that causes sectional division are the railroads. So the railroads, by the time now that we're in the 1850s, the discussion starts that we need to find a way to better communication between, like California and the western parts of the country, the western territories, and the more populated eastern parts of the country. And of course, the best way to do this is to build a transcontinental railroad, which is kind of a side note to that. We're in the 1850s now. The transcontinental railroad wouldn't be built and completed until 1869. So it's still a ways away from actually happening because we kind of have bigger problems in between. But even the construction of this transcontinental railroad becomes a rallying cry for the pro-slavery and the anti-slavery folks as well. Okay, there's a lot of fighting in in Congress over where it should be built. Of course, people in the South want it built in the South because it's going to be good for the economy of the South. The Northerners say, start it from Chicago and start building west from there and connect to California because that makes the most sense because the railroad lines are already so numerous up there anyway, and there's greater population. So both sides kind of want it, and all it serves to do during the 1850s is grow more sectional issues, right? And then in the middle of that, we have a strange territorial gain called the Gadsden Purchase. So when we surveyed the land that was going to make the Transcontinental Railroad in the South, the Secretary of War at the time, Jefferson Davis, who would later be the president of the Confederacy, hired a guy named James Gadsden to kind of survey the land where we would build the railroad. And the land that we surveyed kind of went through part of northern Mexico. So the solution was, well, why don't we just buy that land? So for $10 million, we buy this little sliver, this little portion of Mexico, and that kind of rounds out the lower 48 states. So it's kind of like the southern part of Arizona, and maybe, I think it's mostly just like the southern part of Arizona and maybe a bit of California is what the Gadsden Purchase land is. And we spend $10 million on this little piece of land, where if you remember, the Louisiana Purchase, which was, 15, 20 times larger than the Gadsden Purchase, we get for only $5 million more. So that tells you a little bit about inflation. But in the end, when the Transcontinental Railroad was built, it was built in the north, connecting from Omaha, Nebraska, or Chicago, if you want to extend it, to Sacramento, California. Okay. So one question I want you to answer for tomorrow. This is a political cartoon from the 1850s. Forcing slavery down the throat of a free soiler. Free soilers, remember, those are the people that oppose slavery. So give me a little just a reaction to what do you think the message of this cartoon is as we continue to push the many issues that are leading us towards war. All right. So things start getting worse when we start trying to deal with expanding territories as the populations in these different areas continue to increase. And the biggest one of all is something called the Kansas-Nebraska controversy, or the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was created by Stephen Douglas, who we'll talk a little bit more about tomorrow. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was basically an act that, for one, this is kind of important, it actually nullifies the Missouri Compromise from 1820, which sets off a chain reaction that destroys the Whig Party, because the Whig Party looked at the Missouri Compromise as like their number one achievement, many of them, like the number one thing that they, their party was all about and such a big thing. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act is written. The Kansas-Nebraska Act is written, and it basically says that popular sovereignty is going to decide the issue of slavery in Kansas and Nebraska. Now, we already have popular sovereignty in the Utah and New Mexico territories, but the difference here is the Kansas-Nebraska territory falls within the land of the Louisiana Purchase, north of that 3630 line. So, therefore, it makes, Therefore, it kind of, again, makes that Kansas-Nebraska Act null and void because, it makes the Missouri Compromise null and void because it said all the land acquired north of that 3630 line was to be free. But now we're going to let popular sovereignty make the determination for Kansas and Nebraska. Okay? So Franklin Pierce, because this is in 1854, so Franklin Pierce is the president. Franklin Pierce, as president, as a pro-slavery Northerner, supports the Kansas-Nebraska Act and gets behind it. Why is this a big, big mistake? What do you think is going to happen as pro-slavery Southerners and anti-slavery Northerners flood their way into the Kansas-Nebraska territory to try to get the necessary population to make it slave or free. Obviously, violence. Okay, and that is, kind of what happens here. Okay, and we'll get into that more in a second. Now, I mentioned before that the Kansas-Nebraska kind of divides and destroys the Whig Party. So basically, we get the establishment of a new party here, the Republican Party, which is generally predicated on the stopping of the further expansion of slavery. Okay, so their main objective, right? They do not want to see slavery extend any further. And the interesting thing about the Republican Party is they gain a lot of support very quickly. They were first established in 1854, so you get a lot of Whigs, former Whigs, disillusioned Whigs that join the party, Northern Democrats, and Free Soilers and some Know-Nothing Party members and other groups that join up. So what we've got now politically in America is a very divided country where Republicans are throughout the North and the South is almost all Democrats. And the sectional division in the country reaches an all-time high. Okay, so Republicans come almost exclusively from the North, northern states that oppose slavery. So here we are, it's 1854, 1855, 1856, around there. Sectional tensions are heating up, and ultimately what happens is something called Bleeding Kansas. So, as I said before, as pro-slavery Southerners and anti-slavery Northerners start making their way into Kansas, they're coming with cannons and guns and weapons and all kinds of stuff, and we get kind of sectional fighting and almost war in Kansas. The most notable event of this was something called the Pottawatomie Massacre, where we get our first introduction to a guy by the name of John Brown, who we'll learn a little bit more about tomorrow. John Brown was a man who felt that he was called by God to end slavery. So he goes into Kansas with some of his with a group of people, his supporters, including 4 of his sons, and they go into kind of like a pro-slavery encampment where there was a group of Southerners there, and they hacked 5 guys to death and mutilate their bodies and cut them all up and kind of leave them there as kind of a warning to Southerners that, if you continue to push for slavery here, this is what's going to happen to you. And that's where we get the introduction to John Brown, and this is Bleeding Kansas. Lots of violence, death. I'm not sure the total number of people that were killed, but probably maybe a couple hundred or something like that. Nothing incredibly big, but it shows you the extent with which people are willing to fight to put an end to the condition of slavery. It actually gets worse after that, where we see violence erupt at the U.S. Capitol, and one of the most famous events in the history of the Congress. So there were two congressmen, one guy by the name of Charles Sumner, who was a anti-slavery Northerner, very passionate anti-slavery Northerner, and Preston Brooks, who was a pro-slavery Southerner from South Carolina. Sumner was from Massachusetts. Sumner was from Massachusetts, and Brooks was from South Carolina. And basically, Sumner gives this speech where he kind of calls out a senator who happened to be the uncle of Preston Brooks, and made all these really lewd references about how he was a whore to slavery and all these other things, and kind of sexually based references and things. And Preston Brooks was really upset. So one night after the session of Congress had kind of ended and they'd stopped with meetings for the day or whatever, Brooks goes into Sumner's office and attacks him and beats him incredibly bad with a cane. Sumner tries to escape. He gets stuck under his desk. He actually lifts the desk up like the bolts, because the desk was bolted to the ground, and lifts the bolts out of the ground and tries to escape. Brooks beats him so bad with this cane, that he broke the cane in several places, but continued to beat him almost to death. He had a couple of his guys there that kind of stood in the doorway to prevent other like senators and congressmen from going in to help Sumner, and he nearly beats him to death. It was 4 years before Sumner could actually return to Congress fully recovered. And Brooks kind of got censured basically and kicked out of Congress, but he won re-election anyway. Brooks was also injured in the battle, but but mostly because like he hit himself a couple times because he was swinging so fiercely at Sumner, and as a result, Brooks, because he broke the cane, many people in the South, pro-slavery people in the South, sent him a new cane, and one of them even had inscribed on it. Like, hit him again. Another one said, like, use this one next time or whatever. So we've got a lot of division going on in this country right now, and a lot of factors leading to it. Poor leadership, growing division, new political ideologies that aren't fermented yet, government attempts like the Kansas-Nebraska Act to kind of fix things. But, here we are in 1856, and things are getting increasingly worse, right? So, just a few maps to look at. So here's America in 1850, the Compromise of 1850. Remember, you got your Missouri Compromise line there, lots of unorganized territory. By 1854, at the time of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, we've organized some more of the territory to Oregon. Just get another color here. Oregon, Washington Territory, New Mexico and Utah. Territories are separated. Then you've got Kansas and Nebraska, which is all part of that Louisiana Purchase. They thought Kansas would end up a slave territory. They thought Nebraska would end up more free. But at the end of the day, it didn't matter because we're not adding any more slave states. Okay, so we're seeing the country kind of fill out a little bit. Territories, new areas becoming states. By 1856, we see the election of 1856. And if you notice, it's totally divided. It's totally divided pretty much north and south. California, interestingly enough, goes for James Buchanan. But, here, all these states along the north, they all vote for John C. Fremont, who is a Republican candidate, not a particularly strong one. Lots of states in the south, or pretty much all the states in the south here, go for the Democratic candidate, which at the time in 1856 was pretty divided. The Democratic Party, because you had like the Northern Democrats still a little bit, and the Southern Democrats. The Southern ones were all pro-slavery. The Northern Democrats were against slavery, but they still vote for a Democratic candidate. And you even have a third party, Millard Fillmore, running as a know-nothing in 1856, and he actually wins the state of Maryland. So we've got an increasingly divided country, divided sectionally between North and South, and the coming Civil War looks increasingly inevitable. So that's it for today. Sorry that went on a little long, and hopefully we'll get one more, a little bit shorter one for you tomorrow.